All right, so let's get into this. Most people, if they knew Dr. Daniel P. Brown at all, knew him as this brilliant meditation teacher, a true master of contemplative practice. But what most people didn't know is that behind that persona, there was this entirely different kind of secret life. And this life, it was filled with controversy, conflict, and showdowns with some of the most powerful institutions in the world.
I mean, it sounds like the plot of a spy novel, right? CIA mind control, a presidential assassin, the Catholic Church. What on earth does any of that have to do with meditation? But here's the thing. This isn't fiction. This question is really at the heart of understanding the absolutely wild parallel life of Dr. Brown. So to untangle this whole thing, we've got to follow these threads, this secret history of his.
And you know, to really get the connection, our story kicks off in a pretty unlikely place, the courtroom. See, long before he became famous for his spiritual teachings, Dr. Brown was a major player in the legal world. And this is where we find the first big piece of the puzzle.
He stepped right into the middle of one of the biggest institutional scandals of the last century. Not as a lawyer, no, but as a psychological expert. Someone who could actually explain the devastating long-term scars that trauma leaves on the human mind.
Yeah, that's right. If you've ever seen the movie Spotlight, then you've seen the story of the cases he was working on. He was the key expert witness for hundreds of cases, the prosecution's go-to guy. His job was to stand in front of juries and explain how abuse creates these incredibly deep psychological wounds, and, crucially, why victims often couldn't speak up for decades.
And all this intense legal work, it directly fed back into his spiritual teachings. What he basically realized was, you can't just meditate your trauma away. It doesn't work like that. So he came up with this core idea you see here, growing up versus waking up. Growing up is all about healing that deep psychological damage, and he argued that for most of us in the West, that has to come before waking up, which is the spiritual journey. Because without that healing, the foundation for any real spiritual work is it's built on sand. It's too unstable.
All right, so we go from him taking on the church to what is, without a doubt, his most controversial work ever. For more than 15 years, Dr. Brown poured his energy into the defense of Sirhan Sirhan, the man convicted of assassinating Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Now, to even begin to understand his argument here, you have to know something really important about Brown. He wasn't just any psychologist. He was a world-class expert in clinical hypnosis. We're talking about a guy who could induce and analyze states of consciousness that almost no one else on the planet understood. And that expertise, well, it was the key to his entire legal strategy for Sirhan. So Brown's expert opinion? It was absolutely explosive. He basically argued that Sirhan wasn't a conscious killer at all. Instead, he claimed Sirhan was a hypnotically programmed assassin, a literal victim of the CIA's mind control programs. He pointed to all this evidence, Sirhan's extreme suggestibility, these huge memory gaps around the assassination, and other really bizarre behaviors. Brown's conclusion was that Sirhan was, for all intents and purposes, a human puppet.
And just when you think this whole story can't get any weirder, it does. There's a huge personal twist. See, Brown wasn't just pulling theories about CIA programs out of thin air. As he says in this quote, he had, completely unknowingly, worked at a research center that was secretly a front, funded entirely by the exact same CIA mind control program he was now exposing in court. The irony is just staggering.
And that personal connection? It wasn't just a one-time thing. It turns out Brown's early career had him repeatedly crossing paths with the survivors of the government's most secretive and, honestly, brutal psychological experiments.
Yeah, long before the whole Sirhan Sirhan case, one of his very first jobs involved treating survivors of the CIA's Operation Phoenix in Vietnam. And listen to how he describes it. These were kids who had been psychologically shattered and then rebuilt into assassins. This kind of work gave him a front-row seat, a ground zero understanding of just how deep government-inflicted trauma could actually go.
Which brings us back to that research center. And the contrast here is it's jarring. Look at this. On the surface, the stated purpose, Brown was doing this amazing humanitarian work, using high-dose psychedelics like LSD and MDMA to help terminal cancer patients face death with dignity. But underneath it all, the secret funder, the money was coming from MKUltra. The CIA's most infamous program dedicated to torture and mind control. So here he is, doing truly good work, but it's being unknowingly funded by a program dedicated to unimaginable evil.
Okay, so we've got the trauma expert, the hypnotist, the researcher. I mean, how do all these seemingly separate, really controversial parts of his life actually come together? Well, this is where we start to see the unified picture, the synthesis of it all begin to form. Out of all this incredibly intense work, from the courtroom to these clandestine programs, he developed a cohesive model for healing. He called it the 3 pillars. The first pillar was attachment repair, which is all about healing those deep relational wounds that are so often at the very root of our trauma. The second was metacognitive training, which is basically teaching your mind to watch its own processes, a skill he obviously honed through years of meditation. And the third was memory reconsolidation, a really powerful technique to help the brain reprocess and neutralize traumatic memories. It was a practical, real-world system born from a life spent in the psychological trenches.
And when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, a really clear pattern starts to emerge across all of his work. First, he was always willing to challenge the most powerful institutions out there: the CIA, the Catholic Church, the U.S. government, on behalf of victims. His expertise was always rooted in this deep, deep understanding of trauma and altered states of consciousness. You know, whether those states were induced by a hypnotist, a psychedelic drug, or a meditation master.
And it is so important to understand this advocacy. It came at a huge personal cost. I mean, taking on the CIA and challenging the official story of the RFK assassination, that earned him some really powerful enemies. We're talking about things like retaliatory IRS audits and just intense public pressure. He didn't just talk about this stuff, he really lived with the consequences of his actions.
So in the end, it's this fusion of expertise in trauma, hypnosis, psychedelics, and meditation that created a body of work that is it's truly one of a kind. I mean, who else had this specific combination of experiences? Nobody. And that's exactly why his approach to both psychology and spirituality was so unique. This synthesis, well, that is Daniel P. Brown.
So how do we sum this guy up? Was he a fearless advocate for the forgotten victims of these powerful institutions? Or was he maybe a brilliant but combative person who is just drawn to conflict? You know, the answer is probably both. His legacy is as complex as the very mind he spent his life trying to map. And what his work really shows us is that sometimes the path to understanding the light requires a deep and totally unflinching journey into the darkness.